Well, first, I just want to thank everyone here for letting me share the bima with such esteemed clergy and a wonderful community here. As my second year here as the music director, it's truly an honor. And something really amazing about this project for me is that I feel like I deliver musical midrash every day. What we do in Jewish music, what we do as synagogue musicians is we deliver our very own interpretation, drash, of the material that we're experiencing through our music. And what was really exciting about this was this is the first time I've ever tried to put musical midrash into words. And so I hope you enjoy this. Every year at Yom Kippur, we retell the book of Jonah, his endlessly complicated story of life as a prophet, being asked to deliver word to the Ninevites that if they do not repent for their sins, they will be destroyed by God. But Jonah was an unwilling prophet. When asked to ascend to the role of prophet, he chose to descend, first into the belly of the ship, then to the water, then deep into the bowels of the fish, and finally to the depths of the sea. It is not until he agrees to fulfill the task that God has ordered upon him that he is set free of the fish, free of his sins. Who among us has not experienced this? Each of you be Jonah for one moment. What over the last year have you run from only to be forced to confront it later on? The challenge of putting oneself in the role of Jonah is not an exceedingly difficult one. We are all challenged by the rigors of life, by our family and friends, by the varying circumstances that we all face in our day-to-day lives. While our personal struggles are not always life and death, this uncertainty of the consequences from decisions that we make can cause small moments to seem like the giant fish, consuming us whole until we hopefully figure out how to deal with it. As a musician, I look at most things through a musical lens. I'm always looking for a new way to analyze a composer's body of work and tie it to what I'm experiencing or studying right now. I like to read biographies of composers to help understand what influenced their musical output. This in turn influences my own performance practice. As I read, I like to ask myself, what was the composer running from? What was the significant pressure in that individual's life? How was it resolved, if at all? And what does that sound like in their music? Leading up to this Yom Kippur, I couldn't help but note the parallels between the struggles of the quintessential Jewish composer, Ernst Bloch. First, a little background on Bloch for the uninitiated. Few composers in the Jewish milieu hold as venerated a place as Ernst Bloch. The Bloch Sacred Service is considered in many ways to be the pinnacle of Jewish concert music. It is a through-composed Shabbat service for orchestra and soloist. Personally, I was taken with Bloch first in college, at a very early age. First in college for two reasons. He was the first classical composer I had ever heard that wrote Jewish music. Second, my father had told me that our family's last name, Black, was changed from Bloch upon arrival in North America. I hoped that I might be related to a famous composer. No dice. Same region, different thing. But I quickly fell in love with his music. And just listen, take it in. Bloch's family background is that of a quintessential well-to-do Western European Jew. The first to achieve prominence was Ernest's grandfather, Isaac Joseph Bloch, who in the mid-19th century became a celebrated Baal Tefillah, a lay cantor, in the synagogue in the Swiss village of Lenau. Anyone from Switzerland, I apologize for butchering that name. And he was also the president of its Jewish community. Originally pious, he became an outspoken agnostic, but practiced traditional rituals throughout his life and took his family, including Ernest Bloch, to the Geneva synagogue on many occasions, especially during the high holidays. Ernest often wrote and spoke affectionately of his memories of Friday evenings, Seder services at home, but indignantly of communal behavior, men reading newspapers in the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and the contemptuous treatment meted out to poor Hasidic Jews from Eastern Europe. Immediately in his life, there was a conflict between what he saw as who he could be and who he wanted to be. In essence, he was raised with the same Jewish values and identity any one of us would want for our children to have. However, it was this very identity that posed the greatest challenge for Bloch. Coming up in a time when anti-Semitic philosophies and policies were beginning to take hold in Europe, Bloch struggled with a duality that would plague him for the entirety of his life, achieving musical universality, as described by Wagner, already an interesting juxtaposition in its own right, through the lens of a Jewish musician, something that inherently isolated him from other composers and musicians. He would find himself torn geographically and musically between Germany and France, torn between being European and Jewish, and torn between being a composer of universal music and Jewish music. In 1917, Bloch wrote these words about his Jewish cycle. I am a Jew, and I aspire to write Jewish music not for the sake of self-advertisement, but because I am sure that this is the only way in which I can produce music of vitality and significance, if I can do such a thing at all. I believe that those pages of my own in which I am at my best are those in which I am most unmistakably racial. But the racial quality is not only in folk themes, it is in myself. He was trying to compose something that was purely himself, while trying to fulfill what he viewed as the world's expectation of him. This conflict, the nature of his true identity, would plague him throughout his life. He would constantly struggle with the seeming contradictions of his life. The so-called Jewish composer that had a very peripheral relationship with Judaism. Universalist who wrote ethnically specific music. These internal conflicts consumed him, his very own giant fish. The American rabbi, Dr. Judah Magnus, founder of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, had invited him to a Hasidic community on the Lower East Side of Manhattan for a Sabbath morning service at the end of Passover. Bloch painted a vivid picture of the bare room. The 50 to 60 male congregants of all ages from Poland and Galicia, their poverty, their genuine piety, and how moved he was when the rabbi bestowed upon him the priestly blessing. And what music, he exclaims, when describing the impact of what he interprets as a vivid kaleidoscope of Arabic, Spanish, Russian, ancient, and modern sounds. Neither organ nor instrument, he said, nor choir. Everyone his own instrument. Everything was vibrant, living, creating an extraordinary atmosphere. I dissolved with emotion. I assure you that my music seems to me a very poor little thing beside that which I heard. You will understand everything that this experience means for me. It's a great joy. It's all so extreme sorrow, for my life has been split in two. I would have been able, as a single man, to plunge myself into this truth. Even at my age, 30, I am also 30 right now, by the way, letting it live anew in me, and creating a formidable work, linking this granite past to the present, to the future. Alas, I can't. Everything separates me from it. My wife, my children, my whole life. It's a great tragedy. All that will remain is the shadow of what I could have been. The scholar Knapp wrote that the Hasidic encounter of 1918 precipitated a traumatic collision between the Bloch, who yearned for the intensely observant Jewish life that he had never truly experienced, and the Bloch who lived and participated in the secular world, perhaps with some sense of guilt. Since he could not attain the ideal, he would have to settle reluctantly for the real. But this produced an unresolved inner conflict that resurfaced throughout his life. Like Jonah, this personal conflict does not have a clear-cut solution and ending. While Jonah finally agrees to follow God's command and inform the Ninevites, a city of Assyrians who would have been his own enemy, he does not have the peaceful retirement that he hopes for. The peaceful shaded plot that he hopes for loses its shade and he begs for death. Bloch's lack of resolution is evident in his musical output. While he was trying to hone his Jewish sound, he worked on an opera that would go unfinished, an opera of the biblical story of Jezebel. Now, while this work never saw performance, Bloch used many themes from its subsequent works. The musicologist Clara Morish is keen to point out that later in life, Bloch used the pagan themes from the story of Jezebel in his quintessential Jewish work, Shlomo, Rhapsody for Cello and Orchestra. Pagan themes to represent the Jews in his story. Being a Jewish composer drawn to Germanic music during a rise of ethnic politics and philosophies, with one of his closest friends being a quote-unquote enlightened anti-Semite, Bloch was no doubt conflicted as he played into the very Jewish stereotypes that he was avoiding, creating the idea of Eastern European Jewish otherness in his music. The story of Bloch, a musical Jonah, should seem familiar to all of us. Maybe we are not composers or musicians, maybe we are not prophets trying to save a doomed city of thousands, but we have all been consumed by a conflict. Who among us has not gone on a search for who we are? It's so common it's a cliche. The universalism in the story is not necessarily in music, but in the story itself. Their story is our story. Their struggle is our struggle. It's the American struggle. It's the human struggle. But the beautiful thing about the Jonah story is that the learning moments are not found in the resolutions. They're in the journey. Jonah and Bloch both learned life-changing lessons on their journeys. They made mistakes and they had triumphs. Embrace the journey this Yom Kippur.